Yeah, Thompson's a good place. All right, y'all, we're going to go ahead and start. I'm going to be faithful to your time. Kevin's brought food to everybody from Taco Bell, so I'm excited about it. And so, and so our band's going to be joining us for some of this because they've got practice right after. And so we'll probably run till about 6:45 and until y'all throw me out, okay? I've got a lot of information for you. I'm not going to try to speed through it, but I want you to be able to see and hear as much as you can see and hear, because I'm going to tell you things you don't know. I've done, and I'm not the smartest one in the room. I know that. Chuck is a whole lot smarter than I am, and Nancy is smarter than all of us put together. So I just know those things, but I do think I'm going to share some information that you've never heard before, okay? Now, let's pray before we begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege and the opportunity to be with these folks and to also be with our guests online. May you bless our study tonight. I thank you for what has been, for what is, and I also celebrate what will be. In a time, it seems, of great uncertainty, help us know that you always have been, that you are, and that you always will be. In the name of Christ, amen. Amen. Kevin, will you do me a favor and shut that kitchen door? Could you do that? Thank you. No, I mean, you can bring that forward if you want. All right, so this is a program I did for the local Hartwell Rotary Club. And Joe Whittemore asked me, he said, I wanted to do something different. I want you to do something on Bethlehem, and I want you to tell us some things that we've never heard about the history of Bethlehem so that we can take the opportunity to go have this journey to Bethlehem like we've never done. So I said, okay, that's what we'll do. Now, let me tell you, there are two Bethlehems in Israel. Both of them claim to be the real Bethlehem. The one in northern Israel is wrong. The one in southern Israel is right. All right? Jonathan, you're not at the soundboard, are you? Okay, he's up there. We're online too. So thank y'all for joining us very much. There are two Bethlehems in Israel. Now, these are where they are. If you look at a map, and I don't have my pointer with me. I shouldn't have brought that. But there's one up there by the Sea of Galilee, and there's one, of course, the one that we know is down there by the Dead Sea. You see the two big blue arrows. Now, the Bethlehem is Bethlehem. Bethlehem is how it would be pronounced in Arabic. Now, Bethlehem of Zebulun, and it's mentioned in Joshua 91:15. That is where it is mentioned. And that's 7 miles northwest of Nazareth. Nazareth is a very large city today. It's a large, predominantly Palestinian city. But back in the time of Jesus, it was a teeny tiny little town, not on a single map in the first century. It was tiny. It was really where two roads come together. It was like what we would call Bull Snort today. In our perception of what it is, it was like Bull Snort. There was maybe a Zippy Mart there with one gas place to get gas. All right, Bethlehem, 7 miles northwest of Nazareth. Bethlehem means house of bread in Hebrew. Bethlehem means house of bread. Now, there's a little twist that we will talk about in its name. Bethlehem of Judea, Ephratah. You see that written in the scriptures, Ephratah. Now, these are where Bethlehem is mentioned in scriptures. Now, of course, you don't have to write all this down, but it's mentioned several places. You see Genesis, Psalm, and Micah is Bethlehem of Judah, and that's where Jesus was born, Bethlehem of Judah. Bethlehem means two different things. In Hebrew, it means house of bread. We understand where that really comes from is the book of Ruth, which is my favorite book of the Bible, okay? Remember Naomi and her husband lived in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. And when there was a terrible famine, they left the house of bread and went to Moab, which basically in Hebrew means house of death. All right? So they left house of bread, went to house of death. Now, these are all the references. Now, in Aramaic, Bethlehem means house of meat. House of meat. Very different. And there are reasonings behind that. In Aramaic, it means house of the Lamb, Bethlehem. Now, they would say it Bethlehem, but I can't roll my R's, all right? Now, Bethlehem in Aramaic is the language that Jesus spoke. It's very similar to Arabic, and it was the everyday common language of the people in the first century in Judaism. Hebrew was the sacred language. Aramaic was the language of Jesus. And so for Bethlehem meant, for Jesus in Aramaic, meant house of the Lamb. Isn't that interesting that the Lamb of God was born in the house of the Lamb? And Hebrew, remember, back in Ruth, it means house of bread. Why? Because there were lots of fields where they grew wheat. Now, up in the northern part, it's fields where they grew wheat as well. All right, so those are just some little things to think about. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context of what Bethlehem was like before Mary and Joseph. Now, there are many scholars that believe that Bethlehem is a young city, meaning that it was only created, only built within the last 200 years of before Christ, and then we move into the AD section. Now, people in history books, they call it before the Common Era. Now, a lot of Christians get upset with that, and they say, oh, you're taking Christ out. That's not true. Jesus was probably born in 4 BC because the monk that set up our calendar, the Roman calendar, was 4 years off. And he didn't know it, but we know it now because of what has been written and found in the archaeological record. And so that is one reason they say before the Common Era, and before the Common Era ends at 4 BC and begins where we are today. Okay, I mean, doesn't end at 4 BC, but ends at 1. But Jesus was born probably around 4 BC. And the reasons we think that, I'm not going to go into that tonight because we don't have time, but we can talk about that another day. Now, the area around Bethlehem is farmers and nomads. It lies on the southern edge of the Judean hills. In Arabic, it's Jebel al-Khalil is the name of the hill section. And remember that shepherds were ruffians. They were dirty. They had a specific job, and their job was to raise sheep. And when you raise sheep, you smell bad most of the time. It's hill upon hill upon hill. It's 2,500 to 3,000 feet above sea level. And remember, it's right beside the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on the earth. It's a few feet higher than Jerusalem. You got to remember that. Bethlehem is a few feet higher than Jerusalem, and the Dead Sea is 1,400 feet below sea level. So you see, in a short amount of space, you go a big distance. And Bethlehem exists solely because of its relationship to Jerusalem. The climate is rich, and there's an aquifer in the ground, and all of the water that has ever, okay, hear me, ever come to Jerusalem comes from Bethlehem. So if you want to conquer Jerusalem, what do? Conquer Bethlehem. That's how the Crusaders did it. That's how the British did it in 1917. That's how the Israelis did it in the 67 war. And that's always the case because all the water, Jerusalem is a weird city. It's not built by a port. It's not built by a river. It has no natural water springs except just a few that are trashy. Every drop of water that comes to Jerusalem comes from where? Bethlehem. And that's also where you would tend the sheep and you would raise the sheep. And see, remember, it's all centered around temple worship. That was the importance of Bethlehem in the raising of the lambs. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It became very wealthy because it was on the road from the Dead Sea to the rest of the world. So really, that's where it started. They would mine chemicals in the Dead Sea, and it was a transport system through Bethlehem. And so it was a walled city, it was a gated city, but the wall was probably low because all it had to do was keep sheep out or keep sheep in. And so it's all about the sheep because they raised the sheep for slaughter where? In the temple. Because the whole reason Jerusalem existed was the temple. It doesn't have a port, it doesn't have a river, it has no natural water, but what was there? The rock where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. And that's where Solomon built his temple. And that's where, and then David, started it. Solomon finished it. And that's where the temple was. Remember during the Crusade era, the Temple Mount was a trash heap because nobody felt it had any importance. Isn't that crazy? They would just dump all their trash up there on the Temple Mount because for the Crusaders it was not important. What was important was Bethlehem and also where Jesus walked and where Jesus was crucified and all of that. The Jewish stuff did not matter to the Crusaders at that time. In fact, when the Crusaders came in, they killed more Jews than Arabs. And it was horrible, horrible. They also killed a whole bunch of Christians, but that didn't really matter to them. Now, near Bethlehem, they grow everything. Almonds, apricots, figs, grapes, and everything you could imagine. Lots of bananas come from Bethlehem in the area because they take water from the Jordan River and they use drip irrigation. And the Jordanians and the Israelis have been working together on this for decades, but nobody talks about it because they share the water. There's no natural water that goes from the Jordan River into the Dead Sea. It hadn't been natural water going into the Dead Sea for 20 years. And that's why the Dead Sea is shrinking. It's 3 miles, its coastline is 3 miles shrunk in from where it was just probably 25 years ago. And so in our lifetime, the Dead Sea will become 2 seas unless, and remember I'm telling you way too much, but Jordan and Israel have been working on a project to repump water from the Red Sea into the Dead Sea. And eventually they'll do that. And they've been working on that for 25, 30, 40 years. And eventually they'll do that to save the Dead Sea. Also, the Dead Sea receives all of the pollution from Bethlehem and Jerusalem. All of the polluted water that comes from Jerusalem is pumped through Bethlehem into the Dead Sea. Just raw sewage. And because they don't have anywhere else to put it, and that's there's a long sordid tale about that. Bethlehem connects the Dead Sea to Jaffa and Gaza, where there were ports. And so during the Roman era and before the Roman era, all of that stuff was shipped from that part into the Mediterranean to Egypt, or it could go by land to Egypt, or it could go to Italy, to Greece, all the way to Germania, and also into Europe. Whoever wanted Jerusalem, I told you, conquered Bethlehem. Now, this is fascinating. The aqueduct from Artis to Jerusalem is 14 miles long. That's how long the aqueduct was. If you go direct route, it's only 7 miles. But it does this up and down the hills and over the mountains. Now, this is crazy. It drops 8 inches every 120 yards. And it was built 2,300 years ago. And it was not piped until the middle 1800s. So think about that. All of Jerusalem was watered for over 2,000 years on piping system that was built by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great. And it stayed in effect. It would still be working if it wasn't for the Turks who decided to upgrade, and everything they did went bad. And so they piped it, and then all the pipes broke. And for 2,000 years, and for 2,300 years, it's continued to function from the pools in Bethlehem to take water to Jerusalem. Isn't that insane? It just blows my mind. All right, so let's move a little bit ahead. This is the way Bethlehem was situated in the Old Testament, and how it was the roads between all the connectors between the great countries, the great philosophies of the day. Everything came through Bethlehem. And that's part of why Bethlehem was so important. Now, this is the way Bethlehem looks today. These are the Shepherd Hills. We were on top of Herodian, which was the fortress that Herod the Great, crazy, that's what our guide called him, Herod the Great, crazy. Remember I told you a couple of things about him a couple of Sundays ago. He was nutso. He had his favorite wife killed and then preserved her body in honey. He had two of his sons murdered. And then, just all kind of, and if Herod was mad, everybody was mad, and everybody died when Herod was mad. That's kind of how it all worked. But beautiful countryside. See how green and lush this is? This is the winter. And it's the rainy season when we were there, so it was raining this day. And you can see all the building that's taken place. There are 8 Israeli communities that surround Bethlehem. Many people in the world call those illegal communities because Israel has built them after they said they wouldn't. Now, you can understand why Bethlehem and the Palestinians get upset at the Israelis. They don't have garbage pickup. They don't have running water except for what water is delivered to them. And in many of the Israeli settlements, they water their lawns. So you can imagine. And remember, Bethlehem today is a walled city because it takes you an hour and a half to get out or to get in. And so in the 1970s and late 70s, Bethlehem was 75% Christian. There were 75% Christian Arabs. Now, because the economy and all the mess that they've had to endure, it is less than 17% Christian. And the Christians are very upset at the Americans because they feel like that we have turned our backs on them, and we have. And we have not supported them. And there are Arab Christians and there are Israeli Christians all living in Bethlehem. Many of them are Israeli citizens, and they live in Bethlehem, and we totally ignore them and do very little for them. And so this is Bethlehem. We're up on top of Herodian. Again, I'm just kind of taking a picture just to show you how beautiful the area is. Now, just on the other side of those hills, it goes to straight desert. I mean, it's insane because it's very quick where the change is. It can be snowing in Jerusalem, and it can be 60 degrees at the Dead Sea. And so you can see the extremes in just a little amount of space. And they've completed the roads to the Dead Sea in Jerusalem. You see where they are down at the bottom of the map. And it's great roads. It's like Interstate Highway now. I know that blows your mind, but you can take Interstate Highway to Bethlehem. And it's just insane. And it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Now, Mary and Joseph, okay, remember this is Herodian. It's a man-made hill. It was made with slave labor. Somebody said you can do a lot with slave labor, and you could in Roman times because the slaves outnumbered the citizens 2 to 3 to 1. There were more slaves than any other group. The wealthy were less than 1%, and then there were some merchants in the middle or some tradesmen. And that's probably what Joseph was. He was a tradesman. So we understand a little bit about them. And remember, Jesus and Joseph and Mary walked by this. In the shadow of Herodian is Bethlehem. And that fortress, from the top of that, it had 3 huge towers on it in its day. And you could see the Mediterranean Sea from the tallest tower. Incredible. And it's filled with tunnels and architecture, and it's just fascinating. But he had that built. That was a low-lying hill that he added to. This is us in one of the aquifers in Jerusalem with water that, in fact, is such a large area, it has a little boat in it. And it contains thousands and thousands of gallons of water. And guess where the water comes from? Dun-da-da, Bethlehem. And it's transported to this place by Roman aqueduct that was built in the 1st century. Still to this day. Clear water, clear, you can see all the way to the bottom. And it's huge. And so we climb down these little stairs. I always do that when we go to Jerusalem. And you have to pay $1 and tell them that you love them. And it's a little church that sits at the door of this so they can get $1. And you give them $1 and you go in there, and it's really cool. So now look at this. This is the way that Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem. There's a strong possibility they went through, Jerusalem. We in our own mind, we look at it in European thought and think, oh, they traveled dirt road, and all of those things. It was not the case. They had an income because of whatever Joseph was doing, he could stop doing, and they could travel, and they had money to pay for an inn. Remember, the reason they didn't get to stay in the inn is why? What'd they say? It was booked. And also Mary was pregnant, and this is what our book talked about, that she needed privacy to have the baby. Remember, the privacy laws for Jews were very strict. And so she needed somewhere, and it's not always as we portray it, as no, there's no room, get out. It was where can you be private? Well, I have this place out back, and it's a cave, and it's the best place I've got. And so remember, so they had a little income. He was probably a modest tradesman. 9 times out of 10, he was probably a stonemason, probably not a carpenter. If you were a carpenter, you worked for wealthy folk, and you probably made pretty good money. Disciples were modest tradesmen. What were they? Remember? Most fishermen. And fishermen made pretty good money because they supplied the food supply. All right, so we kind of have a little bit way of not necessarily, we look at it through European and Western eyes. Every significant historical Jewish figure in Palestine from the 1st century to over 600 years later all comes from the area of Galilee. There were great Palestinian Jewish leaders that came from Galilee. The Holy Family would see all the aspects of Jewish life. They would probably stay in Gethsemane. That's because that was the poor area of Jerusalem. That's why Jesus went there later on. And it was where all the potash was put, because let's talk about this for a second. When you have a temple and you're slaughtering 5,000 lambs a day, think about it. The blood flowed constantly. It was a river of blood coming from the temple. And those were celebration days. On the highest holidays, there could be many as 10,000 lambs and critters and birds. Can you imagine how horrible that smell? All right, so think of this. I want you to use your minds. This was the big industry in the 1st century. You've got all those lambs, so you have a lot of meat available, okay? What do you use the lamb skin for? Do you remember in your history books? Huh? Right, you can make things to hold water. Also, vellum. What is vellum? Paper. And so the writing industry in Jerusalem in the 1st century and in the area of Gethsemane, because guess what it does? You have to hang those things to dry and spray chemicals on them. This is when all the books that were filling up libraries all over the world, this is where the paper was made. Because you had so many, anywhere around a temple, any temple in Roman times, is where they made vellum and where the paper industry flourished. Because, remember in Roman times, sometimes there'd be 10,000 to 50,000 bulls slaughtered in one celebration. Can you imagine? And, it's just unbelievable. We just have no concept of just constant going on. Now, the animals would be butchered and skinned. Portions of the flesh would be burned, just portions. The temple be awash with blood. They'd use Bethlehem water to wash the temple down, and then it would flow through aqueducts and go back to Bethlehem, where it would then be dumped in the Dead Sea. Because they didn't want to dump it in the Sea of Galilee, or the Jordan River, or anywhere else, because that's where they got their drinking water. And so they didn't care about the people in Bethlehem, so they shoved it all out there. Okay, now, because they're just shepherds, remember? Rich people don't think about those things because it doesn't matter just as long as it gets away from them. Yes, ma'am? The pipe system was originally built by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And then the Romans updated the aqueducts. Roman technology was a little bit higher than the Greeks, but the Greeks did pretty good. In fact, they had a siphon pump. I get into all this, but the ponds that held the water, they're not called ponds, but there's something else. They're lower than where the pipes had to be, so they had a siphon that worked continually. And that was built by Alexander the Great's men. Is that not, it's just unbelievable. Remember the wealthy Romans had heated floors, they had indoor plumbing. The postal service in Roman times, you could send a letter in Rome, and it would be anywhere in the Roman Empire within 2 weeks. It's incredible. So, in fact, sometimes better than our own. All right. The blood washed into the old cisterns below the temple, and it was flooded out towards Israel. The animal skins would end up in Silwan, and that's near Bethsemane, and that's where they would be dried, and that's where the poor people live, because you put all the poor people usually on the south side of town. Why? Because that's the way the wind blows. And you don't, you know where the toilets in old big masted ships are? Do you know where they are? You think in the back. No. How does the wind blow? That's right. So the toilets are always in the front. If you look at the USS Constitution, the toilets are up front because the ship's moving ahead and the smell goes away because the wind's blowing frontwards and it pushes it out. I mean, so you just, again, we don't think about those kind of things because we don't live it. Now, okay, now let's look at this. Let me just show you. This is the map that Mary and Joseph probably took. They went through Jerusalem more than likely, and then there's Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem. They would go on the right side of the Jordan River. Why? Because it was a brand new Roman road that was built in the 1st century. It was built by the 10th Legion of Rome. Those are some of the old olive trees of Gethsemane. This is where the wise men probably came from. And let me show you, that is part of the road that Mary and Joseph probably took. And look at that. And some of the Roman roads that were built in the 1st and 2nd centuries are still in use today. They would put gravel underneath. It would be crowned at the center, go down like that, and then they would have a piping system on the sides, and it would wash all the water and all the garbage and other stuff away. It was incredible technology. Incredible. But as Bob said, when you don't have to pay your laborers, you can get a lot done. and remember, slavery was huge in the time of Rome, and it was not because of, it was very different than American slavery. It was usually conquered peoples, or you owed money, or those kinds of things. And so a lot of people would sell their children into slavery to pay off debts. And so it was, and if you lost a slave, it was not necessarily an investment. And so you could just go get another one. And it's horrible to even imagine. Now, it was important to Rome because Bethlehem contained Jerusalem stone. Now, it was a white stone that everything is made of in the Middle East. There's no wooden buildings in Jerusalem. Not a single wooden house in Jerusalem. That's why everything lasts so long. There are families that have lived in houses in the old city of Jerusalem since the 1100s. They've owned the house since the 1100s. And they just remain because they're made of that stone. It's incredible. This is some of the groundwork near and around Bethlehem. There are monasteries built all around and all over. And so they used that road. They would drink at fountains, and there was a fountain at the city gate of Bethlehem, and that's where they would have drunk water. The Gospel of Matthew depicts the Magi arriving with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold comes from Ethiopia, frankincense from Arabia and Somalia, and myrrh from Yemen. That just reminds us that Bethlehem was an international town. And when Mary and Joseph came to Bethlehem, they were probably overwhelmed because there were hundreds of thousands of sheep all around. And sheep make a lot of noise. And it was a very busy city, especially if they came at the time of when the sheep were being sold. And remember, I told you this, the Gospel of Luke tells us that the Holy Family were visited by who first? Shepherds. When they said that, when Luke wrote that, the passage of the shepherds is intended to carry shock, because shepherds were not allowed to be a part of anything because they were scoundrels and you couldn't trust them. And all of a sudden, you're confronted with this image that the Savior is met first by people that aren't allowed in the house. Do you see the power of that image? And Luke portrays that. And Matthew does in a very different way with the Magi. And he says, Bethlehem is an international city, and these people came from afar. Remember, they were firemen? And so they came from afar, and they came to worship the baby Jesus in the animal quarters that were behind the inn. All right? Remember also in Bethlehem, because it was so important to Jerusalem, it was filled constantly with soldiers. There were garrisons all around Bethlehem because remember, if you want Jerusalem, you conquer what? So that's why it was always protected. And also, and from the legions, in the Roman legions, they would take land from Jews and give it to faithful soldiers. Now, guess what? Faithful soldiers are horrible farmers. And so then they would lease the land back to shepherds or whoever could grow stuff. At one time, Bethlehem had one of the greatest wine-producing areas in the world. All that's changed today, but at one time it did. They still have they make a vintage, and it's a Bethlehem vintage, and it's made up on the hill in Bethlehem, and it's by some Catholic monks, and they sell their wine just locally. Also olive oil. Olive oil, Bethlehem olive oil is considered to be the best olive oil in the world, but they don't grow as much as they used to, and it's only sold locally within the West Bank. But there were soldiers, the 10th Legion was charged not only with protecting the water supply, but also all the aqueducts. And they were centered at the Herodian and in other garrisons around Bethlehem. This is the earliest map that shows Bethlehem, and see right down at the bottom it says Ephratah. Nobody knows what that means, if it was a region or what, but this map is a mosaic in a floor in a church in Jordan, and it was created in the 6th century. And it shows Jerusalem in Byzantine. Remember, Jerusalem had been destroyed, not one single stone upon the other. And Hadrian rebuilt it. And then when he rebuilt it, he built it as a Roman city. And so you couldn't even tell where things were. And remember, this is the first depiction, the earliest, comes from the 200s it's a grave site in Rome in the early Christians, 200 AD. It was carved in one of the grave sites. Here's a painted depiction of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. This comes from 200, or even as early as 150. So this was right after Jesus' death and resurrection in the early church. And so we know that the Nativity was an important scene for the early church. Early Christians would have seen the poetry identifying Christ's birthplace. Hadrian built a temple over the birthplace of Jesus, also the crucifixion site, so that it would mar the site. But by doing that, he preserved the site. And that's why we know where Jesus was born and also where the crucifixion took place. Because Hadrian destroyed it, covered it over, and built upon it. And you can go down into the bowels of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You give the Armenians a $100 love offering, and they'll let you go down to the Chapel of St. Vartan. And it's where there's a part of the original wall where Hadrian built the temple. And there's an inscription on there in graffiti from somebody in the early church. And he wrote a ship, and he wrote a Latin term talking about the Christ. And not everybody gets to see that. I've seen it like 4 times. You have to make a donation to the Armenian church. So they would have seen all these things. Now, Bethlehem after Mary, this is the beautiful Saint Helena. Saint Helena was the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine. She was a Christian, and it's said that Constantine made Christianity the main religion of Rome. He did not do that. That did not come about until about 150 years after Constantine. We mess up that history. What Constantine did is make Christianity legal, because before Constantine it was illegal to be a Christian. His mother built this chapel in Bethlehem over the site of Jesus' birth. Now this is, let me show you, that's some of the original mosaics from her church built in the 400s. That's the original mosaics. What do you see there? A swastika, because it was an early Christian symbol. That's why the Nazis used it. It was a symbol of purity and complexity and continue like a circle. And so this is from 400s. This is from the 400s, and it's preserved today. And it's incredible to see. There are more pieces of it. It was as big as this room, this floor. And all those little bitty, teeny, tiny mosaic pieces. And it's been preserved. There's more of it. It looks like an oriental rug. And that was in the gathering space of Helena's church. Just absolutely exquisite. The picture on the left is what her church looked like. It was an octagonal chapel over the Bethlehem cave. They eventually carved out the hill and put the chapel over the cave to preserve it. Remember, their whole idea was to preserve these things. Now, Helena's church was destroyed. And then, let me go back, sorry. And then it came back in the 600s, and then this new church was built, and the church on the right is the new church that's placed over the original foundation of the old one. You see how close everything is? This is the church in Bethlehem today. This is an aerial view of the top of it. It's a cruciform. And the circle is where the door is. And there are monasteries all around. Remember, it's divided up between 6 different religions. And so they fight. They have monk fights. And they have to call the police, and people go to jail. They do that in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, too. They'll get in monk fights all the time. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. This is the gateway. You see, it was a monumental door at one time. Now it's been reduced to about that tall, so I have to really duck. They say it was done that way so that you have to bow before you go in. I don't think that's right. I think they did that so that people wouldn't bring their horses in the church. When the knights, remember, this was built by crusaders. This was redone. Many of these parts were redone by the crusaders. When the crusaders got there, see that it was a triple arch door at one time, and you can see how it's changed today. And that's the door you go through when you go into the Church of the Nativity. This is the original, and you see those columns, all those are original. Many of those columns survived from Helena's time. Now, if you look at this, you also see mosaics up on the walls. They've just rediscovered those mosaics. There were only a few up there, and when they were doing work to fix the windows, fix is a good southern term to mean to repair, they discovered that these had been washed over with plaster because they're made with gold and emeralds and all that kind of stuff. So they did that to preserve and protect them from vandals. And so you can see, look how beautiful it was at one time. Now you can see the windows and see all of that connected at one time. But it's all been stolen. It's been reused in other buildings in the area and also in Jerusalem and also in Italy. Now look at that. Every one of those angels has only been discovered in the last 4 years. When the first time I went to the Church of the Holy Nativity, none of those angels were visible because they didn't know they were there until they did the window work. And remember, because of these denominations that control everything, it's very difficult to get anything done. So they do nothing most of the time. Look at that. And when the Persians came and destroyed every Christian church in Christendom, they left the Church of the Nativity because they saw an image of the Magi which said, those are Persians. So we will leave this building. That's why it was preserved. Look at that beautiful artwork. And remember, those things are as wide as those sound cylinders right there. They're huge. Look at the artwork. All this dates back to the 600s, some of it to the 400s. The wood artwork, the carved wood, that's the chancel area. You see those pictures on the columns? When the Crusaders were there in the 1100s, they drew pictures of their favorite saints. Some of them wrote letters to their mothers. There's Tom Jackson. Look at that. That was one of the Crusaders' favorite saints in 1100. And so he put graffiti on this sacred space. Every column has pictures, and on the right is graffiti that was done by one of the Crusaders in the 1200s. When you go in the Church of the Sepulchre, you can see graffiti that has been carved in the wall. You see 1200, you see 1500, you see 1600. You know, when you go to Stone Mountain every now and then, you'll see something from 1950, and you go, woo. You know what I'm talking about. All right, this is the area. Remember, it's Greek Orthodox, so there are a lot of lanterns and a lot of things that we're very unfamiliar with. But it's beautiful. Look at chandeliers and beautiful crosses, icons. Remember, in the Orthodox churches, iconography is very important. So all of those are the disciples and different icons. Some people just get overwhelmed by it, but it's just so cool. This is the door that goes to the cave. The cave is still there, parts of it. There's Lynn's red fingernails. She usually paints them that way before she goes walking around town here in Hartwell. I hope she's not watching. Look at that. This is that is the area over the spot where Jesus was born, and there's a 14-pointed star under there. You see that, and there's a hole where you can reach down and put your hand where thousands of other people have put their hands in. But it's a 14-pointed star. Remember I told you that Sunday? Why is it 14 points? Because there are 14 generations every time between Abraham and Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Now remember the Crimean War in the 1820s. The Russians stole that star, and the British said we must have it back, and that started the Crimean War. That star also has been melted, you can see, because there's been fires. And that star, they really don't know for sure how old that star is. It's been there a long time, since probably the 1600s. That is the area where they said the manger rested. Now the original manger, they say they have it, and it's in the Vatican Museum. I've never seen it. I don't know if it's there, but that's the altar to the manger area, where the birth was on the other side and where the manger sat. Remember, the manger was not a wooden manger. We like to make it wooden because it's easy, and Billy Bob can make that in his garage. The manger was a stone manger that was carved out. These are some of the windows in the Catholic Church that's right beside the Church of the Nativity. Just beautiful. That's the way Bethlehem looked in 1880. That's the way it looked in 1980. And it's even much more today. It's a big city. It's got a good bit of population. It's hard to see this from where you are, but those camel sales. They're selling camels in the late 1800s. And that's Manger Square right there. Bethlehem in 2020, that's Manger Square today. It's been all redone. They took up the rock that was underneath. They found the original fountain that had been there since probably 100 AD. They made a mark of that, and no longer water comes out of that. But that's the original Manger Square. So that was the center, and it may have been the city gate in the time of Jesus, in the time when he was born. Remember the other day I wore Stars and Bucks Cafe? That's a little coffee cafe that makes fun of American money. That's looking, you see that city in the foreground? That's a Jewish settlement. And they water their lawns. They water their lawns. In Bethlehem, you have to buy water, and you get a water shipment pumped in every day. Every household has to buy water every week. Water is rationed in Bethlehem. It's very, very difficult to live in Bethlehem. I'll post this online, the years when all these things were done, because I don't want to go through that tonight, just to tell you. That's from the top of our hotel. We were at the Angel Hotel, which is a beautiful Christian family-owned hotel, and that was the morning of one of my trips. I've been 15 times to Israel, and you see how it's got bigger buildings and apartments, and it's a large city today. This is looking down the street, and there's a great little shop where you can get ice cream and all kind of food down there on the right. But you can see that it's a busy town. It's a busy city today. There's Jonathan right there and his dad. Jonathan is trying to take a picture of a beautiful Palestinian girl, and she ran away. There's Mike and Calvin and Amanda. This is the Shepherd's Fields. You see that? You see the Jewish city across the hill, and so that is it's like these railroad cars behind our church. It's like a poke in the eye constantly to the people that live in Bethlehem. There's a camel that some of our people kissed. That is the Jordan River, and that's at flood stage. It is like, I think it more is like the Ogeechee River in Georgia, up around Warren County. It's muddy, and where Mike is there, you see that tower on the other side? That is Jordan. And this is the site where they believe Jesus was baptized, or near there. And so you can go there and see the water. That is Kathy. She paid extra on the left for that. And then I think that's Kevin riding the camel there. And that is Jerusalem today. And this is looking across the Kidron Valley. There's the Temple Mount where the Gold Temple is. That is the Mosque of Omar is what it's called, or the Dome of the Rock. And then if you see those gray domes just to the left, that is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. Now, one last thing, we're closing up, we're getting ready to let y'all have it. at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was built, remember it was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt. This was probably built around 1100, so it's relatively new in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem. That ladder, because of the way things work in these holy sites, and there's so much fighting in between Christian groups, the Muslims during the Turkish time said, we just can't deal with this. And so a Muslim family holds the key to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Has ever since, let's see, I think it was around 1700 when they said you can no longer keep the keys to the church because there was so much infighting. Now this ladder, because one group put the ladder there and the other group owns the window, that ladder has been at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre since 1728. Since 1728. The shelf that it sits on is owned by one group, the wall is owned by another, and the window is owned by another one. And they have been unable to negotiate. Now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been redone in the past 2 years. It looks incredible. But that stupid ladder is still there, and it's been there since 1728. And I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. Is that not nuts? I mean, that's, oh my goodness. You're right. And that's been there since that time. And so it's called the status quo. And it's all the denominations that run between the Orthodox churches and Roman Catholics. There's an Ethiopian group that lives on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They've been there since probably about the early 1800s. They live on the roof because they have a claim to it. They're smelly, but they're sweet. And I love to go see the Ethiopians because they don't have any, they just live in these little hovels that are no bigger than these tables. And they're just the nicest folks. And I just talk to them and they'll just love on you and all that kind of stuff. Before COVID, you could touch them. Now, I know you don't care, but I'm going to tell you this because I did this at Christmas, so this is the way we're going to stop tonight, okay? The oldest Christian hymn, there's several that are old, but this is one of the earliest ones that we still use today. Most of you already know this. Of the Father's love begotten. It was written in 405 of the Common Era, CE, by Aurelius Prudentius Clemens. Aurelius Prudentius Clemens. It had multiple verses, probably 19, but our hymnal only contains about 5 or 6. But I just want to share this with you, and this is our closing prayer tonight. 405. Christians have been singing this hymn since 405. Friendly Beast is one of the earliest ones, and it was written in the 1200s. The French hymn, Friendly Beast, you know. Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending He, of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. Since 405. So our tradition and our discovery and our joy goes all the way back to Bethlehem, but it extends all the way up to Hartwell. In our new hymns, in our new songs, in our ways of worship today, remember there's nothing new under the sun. And so may God bless you as we journey on this planet together. And may God bless our work. May God bless our play. And may God bless your song as well. Amen. Amen. Thank y'all for being here tonight. I hope y'all learned something. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank y'all for being here online. I want to thank Jonathan. This is the Hope School. This is my last thing. This is the school that we support. This is the computer lab that we built. There's a little sign there. Now we're on a plaque. I said you don't have to spend money on a plaque, but we're on a plaque. And then these are some of the kids. There's Simon in the red shirt who built some of our wooden stuff. The kid in the front, with his hands crossed, he had been burned when he was a child. And some people in the United States, and they were all the sweetest kids, and people in the United States paid for him to have surgery to fix the skin on his hand. And it's just, this is the Sea of Galilee. Next time I go, I'm hoping to go again in October. And so if everything can get cleared up, God bless you, and have a wonderful, wonderful night. So we'll see you. Band, it's yours.